We knew the front lines had collapsed before the cat found us. If we hadn't seen the tide of crab-clawed mutants and silk-draped cultists, then we'd have known as much when the Vox went down and the flags weren't raised. The feline, a little mangy thing that had come skittering into the command dugout, was just the final confirmation. How much of the first company was in that line? Commissar Droita von Sell watched me carefully, the little feline perched on her lap. She ran fingers alongside its head, soothing the fur where the makeshift mask had been tightened. Third Company's Lieutenant Karras had wanted to make sure the thing survived, it seemed. I supposed matted fur was a suitable trade for avoiding an asphyxiated death in chemic fog. Nearly half, I answered, skidding a data slate across the table towards her. Even then, that's only because the other half hadn't landed yet. And the third? Von Sell prompted, holding the data slate away from reaching feline paws. How long until the enemy turns our artillery onto us? If Karras, I nodded to the feline, is to be believed, then the Third Company has expended themselves wisely and met the Emperor in kind. Then we must assume the enemy has our artillery, the Commissar concluded. For now. Commissar von Sell arched an eyebrow and set the feline down on the damp floorboards. Let me guess. More of your grenadiers? Not every problem is a hammer, Colonel. No, ma'am, not every problem. We have infantry and armor on standby for the middle line. What we need is to cut them off in our infantry trench. Grenadiers through the saps between lines. Cut the heretics in our artillery lines off from the rest of their horde. Von Sell nodded, fingering at the straps of the rebreather unit that dangled around her neck. Dangerous? They'll be without support until the guns are back in our hands. We'll send a quartermaster with them, mitigate casualties, and keep them fighting until the lines can be rejoined. Her nose wrinkled at that, reflexively almost. She chewed her lip but said nothing. I understand your apprehensions for Quartermaster Halkrin's eccentricities. Colonel, you're from Krieg. You're all eccentric. She turned to the dugout's door, as if she already expected to find the quartermaster waiting. But he is unnerving. Hello everybody, my name is Colt and welcome to Gone Hollow Minis. I apologize for interrupting the narrative, but before we get into things, I thought there were a few things that needed explaining. Firstly, this is the second part in a series of narrative kitbash videos, and directly follows the story as left off in the first one. So if you're a little bit confused about things already, maybe go watch that one first. Secondly, on the kitbashing side of things, the unit that we're working on today actually doesn't exist anymore. See, back when Krieg was all Forge World resin, there was a unit called the Quartermaster Cadre. This included a quartermaster, obviously, as well as a bunch of other servitor-looking dudes. That unit doesn't have a datasheet anymore, unfortunately, but I thought it would still be great inspiration for a Krieg Command Squad proxy unit. The quartermaster himself will be based off of a Cadian Castellan. All the other individuals will be built using bits from an Inquisitorial Agent skill team that I built forever ago and then didn't do anything with, so it's about time to put their bits to better use. But that's about all that I have for you now though, so please enjoy this second episode in the Lions of Gorgoth narrative series. The Grenadiers were waiting for him. 10 skull-masked faces turned to meet his own as he rounded the last corner. No corpsman is uncomfortable in the presence of a quartermaster. Even while stripping the bodies of their comrades for equipment and vital fluids, they are no more a reminder of a Kriegsman's fate than his own uniform is. No, the thing about Quartermaster Halkrin that unsettled his fellow guardsmen was the company he kept. A quintet of clicking servos, whining pistons, and sloshing feet followed the quartermaster through the trench line as his cadre of servitors, assistants, and assistants that might as well have been servitors shadowed him. The pupilless lenses of the grenadiers fell onto the bone saws and stim injectors of the autochirurgeon, the pennants of the name-taker that bore the numbers of every corpsman to fall on Gorgoth. They were clumsy instruments compared to Halkrin's expertise, but even he could only tend to so many at once. The servitors were merely there to assist. Sergeant 4900992 Dreta, the quartermaster affirmed with a nod. I am Quartermaster 4458790 Halkrin. The sergeant finished for him, finally looking away from the melta-toting servitor at the quartermaster's shoulder and the dribble of oily drool that leaked from its mouth grill. Halkrin held a hand towards the sap's entrance, an unassuming thing framed with wood and not much else. The tunnel would carry them through zigzagging corridors, through the artillery line, and into the infantry trenches at the very front of the Krieg lines. On your lead, Sergeant. The first leg was easy. The tunnels took odd angles, corners seemingly at random, dug so by the engineers to keep the corridors from becoming easy fire funnels in case either trench was overrun. a bit of forethought that was already paying itself forward. Halcrin and his cadre came at the rear, partially for security and partially because of the slower gait of his servitors. He couldn't see much, between the dim sepia glow of lumen tubes and the press of bodies, servitor, and grenadier that clogged the tunnel in front of him. At 3 separate points, Sergeant Dreda halted the column, motioning 2 or 3 of his grenadiers forward. Each time they took the next corner swiftly, disappearing with the sounds of sloshing mud and, soon after, the sounds of combat knives or hatchet blades sinking home through fabric and flesh. Once, and only once, did Halcrin stop to examine the silenced cultists. They were aberrations. During his tenure as a quartermaster of the 179th, Halcrin had become familiar with the schematics of the Emperor's wholly human design. These things deviated from that architecture entirely. Tongues longer than forearms, spines where skin should be, but the worst was the skin. In places it had been peeled away, pinned back with razor-thin wire and barbed hooks, as if only to expose the glistening muscular cords beneath. The work of Halcrin's life was to mend such fibers, but to see them like this, exposed, raw, and still moist, was perversion. He turned the body face down with the steel-shod toe of a boot and continued after the grenadiers. The tunnel came to an end abruptly. Sergeant Dreda took point, crouching next to a sheet of corrugated metal plating that blocked their way. "Infantry trench is past this," he said in a forced hush. "Open ground between this and the next tunnel." The rest of the grenadiers didn't even deign to reply, just shuffled into a 2-abreast line, double-checking the ammo feeds on their hell guns and securing the seals on their rebreathers. For them, the chance at death at an open ground was welcome atonement. For Halcrin, it was just more work. "No cover?" the quartermaster hissed, nudging his way closer to the sergeant. "Our cover," Dreda answered, pointing a finger up to the dripping ceiling, "is there." It started as a rumble, something distant, far off, far enough away to be automatically tuned out, but it was getting closer, louder, even all these feet below the surface. Muffled whumps of ordnance punctuated it, adding percussion to the thrumming rumble. That was soon accompanied by the muted, whining, clanking noise that seemed to orchestrate the score for all the battlefields of the galaxy. Tank treads. "First and second company are taking the artillery trench," Dreda explained, turning back to the corrugate sheeting and slipping gloved fingers around its edge. "They hit the trench, we run for the next tunnel. Quartermaster, if those things of yours can move any faster than they have been, it's time for them to prove it." With a nod, he wrenched the makeshift door open, and was immediately, very nearly crushed by the descending drive wheel of a Lehman Russ. The battle tank caught the far edge of the trench, drive wheels straining, and it pulled itself over the moat with the help of its rear trench rails. Uncaring of how close he had come to becoming another number on the quartermaster's list, Sergeant Dreda bolted from cover. The air flew thick with las fire, with fat raindrops that fell like shells, with the sick, sweet coppery tang of chemical incense that stuck to the back of Halcrin's throat, despite the rebreather. Halcrin drew his power saber, taking its powered edge to the cultists and mutants the grenadiers had wounded but not killed. They were getting worse. Now the things grew arms in excess, had canine claws and bladed exoskeletal limbs where there ought to be hands and arms. And the smell. Every one of them exuded it. A sickly, saccharine stink that Halcrin felt more than he smelled. It settled in his sinuses, slicked down the back of his throat, coated his taste buds in a tangible, oily skein. Of course, his rebreather certainly filtered out the worst of the chemical agents. If it could keep a man alive on Krieg, it could keep him alive here. But still, the sweet stink seemed to stick with him, to wrap itself around him, to hold him in its grasp tighter than any other chemical agent he'd suffered before. A scream pulled his mind away from his las-burnt enemy. A grenadier fell, clutching a smoking hole in his cuirass just below the right shoulder. Not lethal, but the corpsman would be unfit to work his rifle until Halcrin could treat him. So, for now, Stims would have to do. 902, grab him! FT-12 covering fire! Compliance, came the carefully modulated replies. The first of Halcrin's servitors took the grenadier under the arm, bundling him along as the cadre struggled to keep pace with Dreda's squad. FT-12 hefted the multi-melta adhered to its shoulder, sluggishly picking out the largest of mutants to incinerate with its oversized weapon. 7KS, combat stim, half dosage. Compliance. The autochirurgeon's leg servos whined harder as it kept pace with the servitor that was half-dragging the wounded grenadier, its bundle of gimbal-stabilized mechanical arms working to administer the requested dosage. It was sloppy, the needle jabbing into the grenadier at a substandard angle. Halcrin knew he could have done better if he had the time. They forced their way through the throng, loosing hellgun bolts at mutants, ducking beneath gouts of promethium from flamers held by corpsman topside. The 1st and 2nd companies would be stuck here for some time, picking the artillery trench clean while Dreda and Halkran's unit secured the infantry lines. They ducked through the remnants of the 1st battery, over the bodies of the crew and Lieutenant 318894923 Karras. The lieutenant had worked his gun until the barrel nearly melted, the great siege cannon sagging at an awkward angle, its dugout significantly widened by danger-close cannon shots. Halkran would have liked to at least have the time to scavenge the equipment from this battery, but as another grenadier fell, this one not standing back up, he reminded himself that his trade would be better plied elsewhere. Sergeant Dreda waved them through the tunnel, plasma pistol smoking and still gripped in a solid fist. Their losses totaled to 1 dead grenadier, the wounded one, and Halkran's Melta servitor that had fallen prey to a bovine-faced crab-clawed aberrant. All in all, a tally that any quartermaster would deem well within acceptable boundaries. The dead grenadier's number had already been added to Halkran's list by his autoscribe, his equipment left to be recovered by one of the regiment's other quartermasters. Despite being closer to the besieged city of Gorgoth, this tunnel was quieter. The sounds of 1st and 2nd Companies' fight to retake the middle trench eventually faded, muted by distance and muffled by the feet of mud overhead. Still, they walked cautiously, the squad's Melta and plasma weapons at the front of the pack, the latter safely distanced in case of an overcharge incident. The distance between the middle and front trenches was shorter than the first leg of the slog. Even still, the engineered tunnels took turns and bends that made the walk feel longer than it should have been. Eventually, and without incident, Dreda halted the unit before another corrugated metal sheet. Plasma pistol still out, he braced a hand against it and listened. Quiet. Enough to make Halkran's ears ring. Dreda kicked the panel open, and the squad's Melta and plasma gunners stamped through, weapons trained on nothing. The squad filtered through the opening, hellguns braced, aimed at air empty of anything but rain. They all left when they attacked the mid-line, Halkran surmised, kicking clotted mud from his boots. The sergeant shook his head. Still stinks. Halkran had ignored the smell since the middle trench, gotten comfortable with it. But still, it was there. Still condensed in his throat, sick, sweet, but so far without harming him elsewise. Sergeant Dreda waved down the trench, towards the side dugout where a single failing lumen still glowed, casting a weak spotlight on a splintered wooden sign still showing a hastily stenciled numeral 1. 1st Platoon's command dugout, Dreda confirmed, waving the squad on. We find their Vox, wait for the scrap code to clear, and report what we've found. Easy, then. You might not have needed me after all, Sergeant. Halkran kept the sergeant's stride, idly thumbing the clasp on the holster that held his las pistol. The sergeant humphed, still holding his pistol, and reached for the canvas tarp that served as the dugout's door. There was a pregnant moment, still and silent, as Sergeant Dreda studied what was behind that curtain. Then he reached feebly for his rebreather, bent double, and retched. The first thing that reached Halkran was the smell. Where the previous stink of chemicals had been slimy, oily, and distinctly chemical, the wall of stench that wafted from the 1st Platoon's command dugout was consuming. Heady, syrupy, lingering somewhere between the smell of incense and the stink of a charnel pile. It refused to settle in the nostrils and clawed its way up with palpable fingers, up Halkran's face, behind his eyes, touching and needling at his brain. He, unlike the sergeant, managed not to retch, but staggered back on uncertain feet. Only the servitors were unaffected, standing in the invisible effluvium as if it wasn't there. Dreda slowly pulled himself to his feet, settling and pressing his rebreather tightly to his face. 1st Platoon's command staff, he confirmed, straightening his greatcoat. Bonhart, Garrick, fish the Vox unit out of there. I will, Halkran interrupted, waving away the 2 grenadiers and swallowing back bitter saliva. I need to salvage their equipment anyway. Sergeant Dreda cast another shallow glance at the command dugout and shook his head, but stepped out of the way. Halkran soon understood the sergeant's apprehension. Simply put, there was not much left to salvage. The command squad of 1st Platoon had been flayed, all 6 of them. The 5 veterans of the lieutenant's command staff had had their greatcoats rent open, the blue of the 179th mottled with the gemstone gleam of moist muscle. Their lieutenant had been stretched with hook and chain, dangling above his maps and schematics like a red-headed eagle. Halkran carefully sidestepped the display, bending carefully backwards to not touch the dripping chains, and hooked a finger around the Vox set's handle. The stand it was on tipped on the uneven floor, and Halkran jolted forward with the weight of the thing, face brought closer to the heretical idol made of his kinsman's corpse. He steadied himself, sucking breath through his teeth, listening to the tink, tink, tink of falling blood droplets on his armaplas helmet. The smell this close to the body was overwhelming. The air swam thicker around the corpse, as if the smell was breathed from the flayed skin itself. It was oppressive, as if he could feel it greedily replacing the air in his lungs until only it remained. He took another shallow breath, forcing his mind to focus on the mission, on the Voxcaster in his hands, on anything. When that didn't work, he held his breath, and with complaining lungs turned his back on the horrors behind him. The lieutenant took time to get down. The chains that held him aloft were sturdy, fastened without visible welds. The ends even seemed to blend seamlessly into the rockcrete ceiling. No fastening, no bracket. The links just disappeared, as if they'd been put there when the slab was poured. Halcyon knelt, in the dark, that Empyrean stink still thick in the cramped room, and worked. Severing ruined equipment harnesses, salvaging what uniforms he could. His servitors clicked and whined, making sloppy attempts at the work Halcyon had perfected. He swallowed the urge to send them away in the name of efficiency alone. With each of the 6 bodies he salvaged for equipment, patterns formed. Careful angles in the lethal incisions, symmetry in the swaths of removed epidermis. A stray finger of his brushed against a patch of muscle on the lieutenant's breast, and it twitched.
Little apothecary.
Halcyon jumped, hand slapping to the handle of his las pistol. The grenadiers were still outside, and the dugout only had one door. There was no one there to have spoken.
How joyless you are. How joyless your kind always are. But you, they see such perfection waiting in you. Carolon will love thee.
A hand clasped hard around his leg. His head snapped down to see the red hand of the lieutenant, his body, at least, planted firmly around his ankle. The lieutenant's lidless, reddened eyes looked up at him.
Look closer.
As if Halcyon could have looked away. He stared at the lieutenant's skinless face, the grain of his muscle, the intricate, purposeful perfection of the fractal-like blood vessels. He saw the design of it, the perfection of it, something natural and complete and oh so much older than the corpse he worshipped. It was flawless.
We have such perfection to show you.
It was the smell that first tipped the sergeant off. That sick, sweet stink turned acidic, sour, as if it was eating away at the back of his throat. The screams were next. Muffled, of course, through the filters of the quartermaster's rebreather mask. Sergeant Dreda spun on his heels, plasma pistol ripped from its holster. Quartermaster Halcyon dangled stiffly from the low ceiling of the dugout. Chains, the same as had held the 1st Platoon's lieutenant, snaked around his limbs, pressed around his neck, each length ending in a gilded hook that embedded itself into a different artery. Wherever the chains touched, they sheared through metal and fabric, crisscrossing the quartermaster with weeping lashes. Impossibly, the wounds wept upwards, drops floating into a gathering puddle that condensed on the ceiling. The puddle rippled, and something reached back out. An arm of porcelain lavender skin, so much like the reverential marble statues that Dreda had seen on so many other worlds. But this was not the arm of a saint. It gave way to a shoulder crusted with arenaceous, needle-like spines, spiderwebbed with scars and tattoos whose shapes made Dreda's eyes ache. Behind his mask, the sergeant sneered.
"Garrick, Melta!"
The grenadier rounded the corner as if he'd been waiting there, shouldering the melta-gun and firing openly into the darkened doorway. Halcron's screams cut sharply, replaced by an unearthly shriek that played itself 6 times over in Dreda's head. The arm slithered back into the pool of gore, disappearing, leaving the dugout empty save the smoldering remains of corpsmen and servitors. "Sergeant?" Bonart knelt over the Voxcaster, hands working carefully over the knobs and readouts. "Vox is almost clear. Command says 20 minutes until 2nd Company's tanks reach these front lines. Enemy's been routed from the artillery trenches, but they're fleeing right back onto us." "Yes, sir." Dreda gave the quartermaster's body one last glance. This was hardly his first experience in fighting heretics, but never had he been so close to the uncleanliness they flirted with. The thought gripped his spine with chilled fingers. He suspected the quartermaster had not been so repulsed. Such was the weakness in those who strayed from the Emperor's light. A risk for all, even the men of Krieg.
"Finish clearing the Vox,"
Dreda ordered, stepping up to the trench line.
"The enemy will be on us soon. We're to make up for our quartermaster's failure. For Krieg, for the fallen of the 1st and 3rd Companies, for the Emperor. Send them back to the gods they worship."
Thank you all so much for watching this episode. If this narrative type of content is content that you'd like to see more of, please make sure to let me know in the comments below. I'd love to keep working on stuff like this, whether it's continuing this one storyline or branching off into different one-off episodes. Let me know which one you'd prefer. In any case, if you enjoyed, why not drop a like to let me know. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please drop them in the comments, I'll be sure to answer them. Subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss an episode, and until we meet again, friends, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.